The biggest stars in music, a lot of them still come from Disney.
Disney sold the rights to some music from Snow White and seemed to regret that and realize how much more success they could have had if they had those rights. So that was part of the reason why there was this emphasis on why do we not own all parts of the pipeline?
It feels like the 2000s really was the moment. Hilary and Miley being the two biggest examples of that. One of the challenges that Hilary and Miley eventually had is they were so synonymous with these shows and these characters. They wanted to make more mature sounding music and have more mature sounding themes.
There's so many of these double-edged swords where Disney is super adept at kicking off these careers, but there's a lot of growing pains that come with it.
Is there a star that came through Disney that you feel like, oh, I wish that they could have had a second chance?
That's a really good question.
As media is more fragmented, it should seem that the impact of Disney has less influence. But on the other hand, the biggest movies of 2024, Disney movies.
I think the difference now is that Disney as a brand and a legacy doesn't have the same power with today's kids as it did when we were growing up.
We're going to talk all about Disney, the company that has a pipeline of pop stars and music that have continued to have influence in culture. You look at some of the biggest stars, even today, in a landscape that's more fragmented than ever, Disney is still the place, breeding stars like Olivia Rodrigo, Sabrina Carpenter, or even a generation back, you look at Miley Cyrus, Selena Gomez, Demi Lovato, or Hilary Duff. And then if you go back to the Mickey Mouse Club days, you had Justin Timberlake, Britney Spears, Ryan Gosling, Jay-Z, Shazay, Christina Aguilera, and more. The history of Disney and music has been a fascinating one, so we wanted to dig in and talk about especially some of the early days and how it fits into that infamous Walt Disney synergy map and how that evolved over time, and some of the challenges too, because even though this pipeline may be quite strong, there were plenty of times where Disney didn't quite capture that value. Sometimes when it seemed like they got it just right, maybe they captured a little too much value, and how to find that right balance. We also look at what makes Disney unique, because you look at networks like Nickelodeon, and despite stars like Ariana Grande that came through there, it hasn't quite been able to generate the same level of consistent success of hit makers that come through like Disney has. So we look at Disney specifically. We look at its record labels from the Disney Music Group like Hollywood Records. What does that pipeline look like? Where's the value captured? Where is it not? And where do we expect to see this continuing on moving forward? But even beyond the pop stars, Disney's influence in some of the most popular movies has been clear too. It's musicals, especially that golden age of Disney, The Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, or The Lion King, or even more recent ones like Frozen, Encanto, and Moana. The music and the songs from these movies continue to resonate, and you continue to hear on and on and on, especially if you have young kids. So today we dig into Disney's pipeline in music, and I'm joined by Tati Cirisano from MIDiA Research. So hope you enjoy as we share our insights and embarrass ourselves with our own memories of Disney music and more. Let's dive in. All right, we're here to talk all about Disney and its influence and journey in music over the years. We're with Tati Cirisano from MIDiA Research. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for bringing me on this nostalgic journey where I'm surely going to embarrass myself remembering all the Disney Channel that I used to watch and the Hannah Montana that I was obsessed with.
I think the embarrassment on my end is going to be seeing what my YouTube algorithm looks like now.
Oh yeah, I totally messed up all my algorithms doing research for this episode.
We should probably talk a little bit about why we were both interested in this topic. So many companies in music, media, entertainment are always chasing and looking at Disney as influence and as inspiration. But specifically in music, when you look at pop music over the past 20, 30 years, even today when the landscape is fragmented as ever, there is still that strong Disney pipeline. And whether it happens immediately, whether it happens a decade later, the biggest stars in music, a lot of them still come from Disney.
Yeah, and when a lot of music executives talk about how the industry needs to evolve, and particularly labels when it comes to nurturing fandom and having more control over the pipeline and things like that, there's two examples that come up every single time. It's Disney and Marvel, and Disney owns Marvel. So it's such a common role model for a lot of music companies. Yet I feel like sometimes it's the fact that Disney has had so much success in music is glossed over in those conversations. Oh, music needs to be the Disney of music, but Disney is the Disney of music.
One thing that stuck out too, just doing some research with this, you go back to the 40s and a lot of the vision and focus for what Walt Disney was doing was music rights specifically. And it was having those music rights and making deals directly with the major record labels at the time. But it was in the late 50s when we need to have our own Disney music group. This was around the same time where the famous Disney synergy map was also coming into play. You started to see the latest iterations of it, and there is a place specifically for music, so it did make sense to say, yes, let's have our own home here. We already have these soundtracks for the movies that we put out, but let's put a little bit more emphasis behind it.
Yeah, totally. I read something about how Disney sold the rights to Snow White from the music from Snow White, which was one of their earliest successes, and seemed to regret that and realize how much more success they could have had if they had those rights still. So that was part of the reason why there was this emphasis on why do we not own all parts of the pipeline and invest as much in the creation of the music as we do in the creation of the film, and all the ways that that ecosystem can thrive as a result. I think it being so baked in from the start is part of the reason for success 20 years, 30 years, 50 years down the line.
The Snow White example is key because one of the biggest influences for companies wanting to own more of the value that they create is losing it at some point and realizing, oh shit, we should have done that.
Totally. Yeah.
You may have picked up on this one too, but doing a bit of research in the origins of Hollywood records, which I'm sure we'll talk more about, that was in 1989. Of course, things were a bit more developed for Disney at that point, but Disney was also starting to hit a bit of its golden age with a lot of the movies like Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, The Lion King. But Hollywood Records specifically was also trying to get more involved with things outside of Disney too. And there were a lot of groups that they tried to sign. This is an interesting list here that I saw. So they tried to sign Nirvana, Smashing Pumpkins. Who else do we have? Naughty by Nature and Dr. Dre. I look at that list
Whoa.
and I'm like, what is this? Jimmy Iovine and Interscope? Disney's going up the bat trying to compete with them. At one point, Disney did sign Queen. This was shortly before Freddie Mercury passed away, but Disney did sign
I did not
Queen,
catch that.
and they had the rights to Queen's music.
Yeah, and I think it seems based on the timeline like the Hollywood Records didn't fully click until Disney managed to really marry Disney Channel with Hollywood Records, which was that was the whole point of the synergy map from the beginning. But it seems like there was a period where the Hollywood Records was almost trying to be too far removed from the Disney ecosystem, and it made a lot more sense once they started to put the pieces together.
The synergy wasn't quite synergizing, especially in the 90s, right? You had this moment where the Mickey Mouse Club was taken off and the Mouseketeers were doing their things, and a lot of them were artists who became the biggest names in music or even Hollywood. You had Justin Timberlake, Britney Spears, Christina Aguilera. You had JC from NSYNC.
The roster is insane.
Yeah, you get Ryan Gosling as well. But none of those people that I just mentioned were signed to Hollywood Records or any of the Disney music groups. NSYNC and Britney were with Jive, and then Christina Aguilera was with RCA. It really wasn't until Hilary Duff and Lizzie McGuire that you saw the full package really come to life.
Yeah, totally. And reading about the history of Lizzie McGuire, which I watched so much as a kid, I learned that it was almost by accident that the music synergy happened, where Hilary Duff came to the producer of the show and said, I want to sing. And they said, okay, we'll introduce you to Bob Cavallo, who was the DMG chairman. And he said, okay, let's do it. And there was like this synergy that came out of that. And then with the Lizzie McGuire movie, there was a music element, so you could live the movie by listening to the music. And I think seems to be the moment that there was everything clicked, and there was this light bulb moment of, if we make more shows that are about music, then this whole world opens up where people can live that TV show by listening to the music, by going to the concerts and all of these things. And from there, you get to Miley Cyrus, you get to Cheetah Girls, you get to High School Musical. Like, it seems like something really clicked there, and the synergized for the first time.
It feels like the 2000s really was the moment there. Hilary and Miley being the two biggest examples of that. I wasn't the biggest watcher necessarily of either one of those shows. I'm not even saying that from a pride perspective at all. I was still watching cartoons.
Dare you look down on us?
2000s, right? But I did always recognize the huge success that the music had. Even Metamorphosis, that was the first album she had, and that was the first like true big hit that Hollywood Records had. And you saw the show continue on, but one of the challenges that Hilary and Miley eventually had is they were so synonymous with these shows and these characters, and they didn't
Yeah.
necessarily want to get typecasted with that. So as they became older into their teen years, they wanted to make more mature sounding music and have more mature sounding themes. And it seemed, at least on the Hilary Duff side, that was a bit of the tension that made it difficult for that show to continue on. So they eventually stopped the show, and Hilary had eventually taken a little bit of a break from music as well, and just talked about the mental toll having and being a child star can have on you. We probably saw that even stronger with Miley Cyrus as well. Although her music career definitely went in a bit of a different journey than Hilary's did.
Hilary on screen was Lizzie. Miley on screen was Miley slash Hannah. So she was really, I think, I'm trying to think back on it, how I interpreted her persona, her character. I feel like I assumed that who she was on the show was who she was in real life. And Miley has talked a lot about how one, she felt she couldn't separate herself from her on-screen persona, and that was difficult. And two, she had this fear that she, as a music artist, separate from Hannah Montana, would never be as successful as Hannah, who is her, but is an extension of herself and not like maybe her true self. So yeah, it's once we start looking at kind of the pros and cons of the Disney pipeline, there's so many of these double-edged swords where Disney is super adept at kicking off these careers, but there's a lot of growing pains that come with it.
And this whole evolution of these artists that may start as these cookie cutter and try to shed that image, that's been dating back since the Mickey Mouse days as well. You saw Christina Aguilera. I remember when Dirty came out and that whole album, that was like a whoa, okay, this is very different from what we had before. You could say Justin Timberlake had his own version of that. Of course, Britney Spears. So then I think Miley Cyrus, hers probably followed a similar path. 2013, 14, like she was making the songs with Mike Will Made It. And she had that VMAs thing with Robin Thicke.
Yeah, the topless photo shoot. Like there were so many. I remember all these moments so well and how fierce the backlash was.
You even see it now to some extent. Look at Sabrina Carpenter. So she's on that Girl Meets World show, that traditional Disney, ABC family kind of vibe, and you listen to her music and just her whole aesthetic, and that's about as anti-Disney persona as you can get. You mentioned earlier about just the pipeline and the ecosystem of merchandising and all this stuff that clicked. One of our producers on the show, Eric, had mentioned calling out Nickelodeon specifically as a contrast, and why Nickelodeon hasn't necessarily been able to replicate this. Ariana Grande is likely an exception here as someone that did grow and come out of that. I think there's also a case to be made for Drake to some extent as well, because his show Degrassi was licensed from Canada, but it wasn't put on Nickelodeon itself. It was put on Nickelodeon's digital cable channel of Noggin or Nick Teen. I definitely watched more Nickelodeon as a kid personally than I did Disney, but I think that a lot of the artists that tried to come through there, whether it was Miranda Cosgrove or Victoria Justice and others, part of it was that same Lizzie McGuire thing you're talking about, but to a further degree of the character and the persona of the actor on screen for the kids show not feeling like a separate person from the singer itself. And I think that's something that Disney definitely learned over time, but it felt like with Nickelodeon, they couldn't quite get that. Ariana's success specifically comes from her literally shedding that and working more traditionally with the major record label system and doing her own thing.
Yeah, and they also didn't have as extensive of a synergy map as Disney, didn't have as many sort of touch points or promotional vehicles. Like Radio Disney was a huge part of helping the Disney Channel music become successful, which doesn't exist anymore, RIP, but that was a big part. And Nickelodeon didn't have the same sort of promotional funnel. I think it's also, to credit Disney, it's really hard to make these things work because everything has to be excellent. The TV show, the acting, the music, how it all fits together for the whole thing to be a smash success. And maybe you just need that big of a synergy map behind it to have all of those components work. But yeah, I also just keep coming back to how, even though Nickelodeon did have some shows that were about music, like Naked Brothers Band and things like that, Big Time Rush was Nickelodeon, I think. They didn't have as many. Like with Disney, they really, really zeroed in on that theme of shows about artists or people in theater or whatever it was. And Nickelodeon never fully went down that lane.
Relatively speaking, I think Nickelodeon's bigger success was in animation, at least on the TV side of things, versus
Yeah.
Disney leaned more into these real people shows that were based on an actual kid. Nickelodeon had some of them, but I don't think it was as much. The Nickelodeon shows also were a bit wackier. Like Nickelodeon's whole vibe was also
Yeah,
just a bit different, right? If someone was
totally.
singing, it was Amanda Bynes like almost singing intentionally bad on purpose to try to be a bit like wacky and zany on camera. And I think that may be a little bit harder to translate, especially if the goal is to try to maintain that same persona in your acting versus your singing in that way, versus there's probably less of that to my memory with
A
Disney
thousand
shows.
percent. That's a really good point. Like Disney, you associate with theater and performance because it's Disney. Nickelodeon, I associate with slime, which
Right.
is like a great brand for them, but it's a totally different brand than Disney's.
Speaking of slime, I should do a brief segue to say that when I was 10 years old, I did make a trip to Nickelodeon Studios, and guess who got slimed at
Love
Nickelodeon
that.
Studios?
Oh my God, who?
It was me.
Oh, you were gonna say you like saw some celebrity get slimed.
It's so funny the response
That's
there. I
so
thought it was
much
gonna be
better.
like
Yeah.
a. It was me in my Penny
That's
Hardaway
so
jersey
funny.
that I just worn that day because I
Oh,
wanted to be cool. I was in Orlando. I needed to dress like how I thought Orlando people did and wear a Penny Hardaway jersey. But luckily, they gave me a change of clothes and they picked me out of the studio audience that was there. And they gave you a little frame plaque, and
where is
I
this
had that up.
clip?
Oh, I don't know if there's a clip online. If there is someone who videotaped it, I think my mom has a picture that she took with me getting slimed at the point. But
Oh my
yeah,
God.
that was my claim to fame.
That's
They gave me a little
amazing.
certificate, had it up in the house for years. It's probably
I
still in
need
my parents'
I
house
need
now.
to see that. Wow, I love that so much. That's the best answer that I could have gotten.
I know. I felt slightly disappointed when you were like, "Wait,
I
who?"
know. I
You
don't know
probably wanted
why
me
I
to
was
say, "Oh,
expecting.
I don't know." It was some.
Thinking about, remember they used to slime people at like the awards and stuff like that, and you would be like, oh haha, like there's Britney Spears getting slimed or whatever it was. But I'm so glad it was Dan Runcie. 10-year-old Dan Runcie.
10-year-old me doing his
Yeah.
thing. But yeah, so I think for me, Nickelodeon always did feel a bit less focused in music in that way. But I
Yeah.
do want to give a shout out to a few things though, because I think All That. Did you watch All That?
Oh, I totally forgot about it, but yeah.
It definitely was SNL Junior in a lot of ways, and we literally saw Kenan Thompson make that transition and still doing his thing, 20 plus years later. But
Yeah.
they did a good job of that, but they also leaned heavily on hip hop and R&B, especially a lot of the stuff that was popular in the 90s. And I think for a lot of people in our generation, that was always a staple of, oh, look, TLC or Naughty by Nature or whoever is going to be on the show. And I also think about Keenan and Kel, specifically the TV show, because Coolio had done the intro song for that. And this was shortly
Amazing.
after Gangsta's Paradise and all those songs had blown up. So it felt like even though they didn't have a big focus there was always a bit of a hip hop and R&B pulse that
100%.
you could see with established stars at least coming through Nickelodeon.
Yeah. No, that's a great shout. I totally forgot about all that. Sorry, all that.
I know, but I wish there was just a little bit more. We talked a bit about this 2000s era for Disney, looking at the Hilary Duff and the Miley Cyrus time frame. But Lindsay Lohan had her moment as well. Then with High School Musical, you had Zac Efron and you had Vanessa Hudgens, you had Ashley Tisdale and a few others that even though they didn't have the biggest music careers, I think some of them have probably pivoted a bit more into acting than others. So even if it doesn't take off in one thing, you can still see it continue in other things potentially.
Yeah. And a lot of Disney stars have talked about how Disney was almost like this training camp for them to hone their skills and figure out what their strengths were and what they wanted to do. So I do think with a lot of those that maybe didn't pan out in the music direction, it was potentially a conscious choice to pivot more into the acting lane. So I think of Disney almost as like the training grounds for that. And they've taken advantage of that in some ways. Like I know at some point, DMG had first option to sign artists that came from Disney Channel shows. I don't know if that's still the case. But yeah, thinking about it as incubator is interesting.
Miley Cyrus is probably a good example of this because Hollywood Records was pushing a lot of those early albums, but for her, when she wanted to make the leap, she ends up signing with the traditional record label. And I think that was one of the things that you and I were talking about. Of course, Disney is the incubator for a lot of this. Are they capturing that value if they are the quote unquote Y Combinator? The difference, though, is that in tech, it's not like companies want to shed their Y Combinator association as they continue. If
Totally.
anything, they want to keep it. The founders still leave it in their profile that, oh, our startup was part of YC Winter 2021. But in music, you saw that recently, even with Olivia Rodrigo. This is what, 5, almost 6 years ago at this point, but she had the option to be with Hollywood Records, but she said, no, I want to be with Geffen. And based on the way that her career went, it's hard to say that she made the wrong call or even wonder what it could have been. I don't think her career could have gone any better the past 5 years.
Yeah. Yeah. And Disney does have brands that I feel like you could, as an artist, stay in that label and not be part of Disney so heavily. Hollywood Records is super associated with Disney, but if you're the average consumer doesn't necessarily know that this artist is signed there or whatever. One thing that I didn't realize is like Plain White Tees were signed to Hollywood Records, Breaking Benjamin, a couple of other artists that I just wouldn't have associated. But anyway, I say all this because I guess the question is whether these artists can feel that they can grow while still being attached to these Disney companies, or if the mere being under that umbrella interferes, either because the artist feels that way or because there's actually pressures being put on them by the executives at the companies. I know they also own S-Curve now. I could see a world where, especially with Disney being so acquisitive, there's other brands that these artists can potentially grow into and stay within the system. I just don't know if for some of them, just the mere association is enough for them to feel like they want to break out of that for whatever project they want to do.
Yep. S-Curve is a good call out because Steve Greenberg had brought that back, and then it was 2021 when that came out, and then that Andy Grammer song, You Got to Keep Your Head Up, that one had come through there. So I do think that it is possible if things are positioned to have record labels that don't have that association. Disney did this well in movies. They were home to Miramax, and Miramax didn't pull any strings with the type of stuff that they put out, especially in the 90s and the early 2000s there. It's definitely possible in music, but I think that part of it too is if there was a Geffen, Interscope, Republic, Atlantic equivalent there, then maybe the artist would feel different. If you're trying to get to a certain level, then someone is likely going to push you to be with one other part of the three major record labels.
Yeah, and I also think that there's a challenge that comes with creating this sort of synergy and this ecosystem, which is sometimes you become, I think, so adept at creating things within that closed ecosystem that they can't break outside of it. So you might be extremely successful within that ecosystem, but if the artist wants to break out of it for reasons creative or financial or whatever it is, that system can struggle to help them do that.
Part of it too does highlight a bit of the difference of how an artist is looking at who their audience is and how they manage that versus a corporation like Disney. Because Disney, especially on the film side, is always thinking about, okay, what is the 4-quadrant thing? Men, women over and under 25 years old. And that was the case 25 years ago, that was the case 50 years ago, and that's still the case today. So there's people 25 years ago that would have been in a different bracket than they are now. But if you're Justin Timberlake and your audience in the late 90s and early 2000s was millennial girls, yes, when they were teenagers back then, the type of music you're making is great. Is he still trying to continue his career? His core audience is still largely millennials. If you're an artist, your audience is this moving parade that continues with you as they age. But if you're the corporation, you're still trying to reach this demographic regardless of what year they were born in.
Yeah, totally. Like I think the Disney artists have kept that like fan base loyalty because the fans have grown with them. I feel an example of that. I feel so protective of Miley Cyrus because I grew up watching Hannah Montana and I love her as an artist. But those fans age out of Disney. So the artist kind of keeps them as they go beyond it, but Disney does not and has to keep reinventing itself for the next generation.
We may look in look back and be like, oh, wow, Miley Cyrus or Britney Spears really made a pivot from what they were doing a few years ago. But also think about what it's like to be a teenager, right? You go from being 12 years old and you're watching maybe a mix of MTV, but you're still maybe watching Disney, some Nickelodeon. And then 4 or 5 years later, you're sneaking off with your friends trying to get beer from someone else and go to some house party.
Yeah.
That's how much things change in a 3, 4, 5 year span. So it's hard not to expect the artist to not evolve with that.
I think that's also, we've talked a lot about how the artists can feel that pressure and to keep things PG and how that negatively affects them. But I think it's also a challenge for the company itself, because the truth is that kids will always want the thing that they can't have, and the thing that seems like, oh, all the older kids have this and my parents won't let me listen to this, and etc. They're always going to lean towards that. So as a company that caters to kids, it's hard to be cool.
And I think too, looking at non-Disney entities, especially in the age of YouTube, in the age of TikTok, what does this look like moving forward? As media is more fragmented, it should seem that the impact of Disney has less influence than it did on you or I 20, however many years ago. But on the other hand, the biggest movies of 2024, Disney movies. I'm talking about Inside Out 2, Moana 2. So how do we circle that? How much is changing and how much has stayed the same?
I think the difference now is that like Disney is still having a lot of individual successes, but Disney as a brand and a legacy doesn't have the same power with today's kids as it did when we were growing up, mostly just because of in part because of how fragmented entertainment is now, which every company is dealing with, but also because when you're a company, even as old as Disney, that is your brand and your legacy is a really big selling point. It's only that big of a selling point to the extent that the new generations continue to feel that brand and that legacy. And I think it's just harder to keep that alive with every new generation, especially as there's way more competition for people's time and attention. So I think it's a challenge.
When you were growing up, were you a Disney princess person?
There were Disney movies with princesses that I was really into, but I wasn't like buying all the dresses and like things like that.
Okay. The reason I asked that...
Were you hoping I said yes? Because you had a follow-up?
No, I wasn't hoping you said yes. You didn't like stall any thunder. The reason I asked that though is because I know so many people around our age that had the whole, whether it was Ariel or Belle or Jasmine or whoever, there was some person from that Disney golden age, one princess from that era that was like their person, right?
Oh yeah, I feel that way. I feel that way about Ariel, but... Okay. Yeah, so I guess I was a princess kid.
When I'm with my kids or on the playground, I hear them talk about Elsa this way from Frozen, even though to my memory, she wasn't technically a princess, but there was still a bit of that obsession. But again, I don't have the data necessarily to be able to say, oh, Elsa's big, but was Elsa or Moana or any of the others that have came through in the past decade, were they as big as Ariel, Belle, Jasmine, etc. from 30 plus years ago? My gut says maybe not, but also, I don't know. It's hard for me to gauge that precisely.
But that's a good point, though, is that there are more recent of the Disney universe that Disney has created and that little girls and little boys have been obsessed with and begged for all the products for Christmas. They're still able to do that. I guess my question is more like, does Disney as a name hold as much weight as it did? Or are they just like thinking about things more by just this character and this individual piece of content?
Would comparing theme park attendance be a good way to measure that? Or does that almost include too many other factors where it's hard to use that as a proxy?
Good question. It might be too many other factors because it might just also be like, I don't know, just more competition for your time and your spend and things like that might affect the theme park thing.
Yeah, and I think flying in general is just much more... commonplace.
It could help tell the picture. It could help give some indication, though, I think.
Yeah, and these parks are just so much more developed, so it's not even fair to compare Magic Kingdom in 2025 to Magic Kingdom in 1995. It's safe to question and wonder, can anything come in the future that can have this same type of pull or influence, especially with regards to music or the development of music talent in this way that Disney really is an incubator for that? Do you think we could see something else at that level? I'm skeptical, but I do have some nuanced thoughts on it.
Yeah, I when I was a kid and I got home from school, I would just turn on the TV and switch between Disney Channel and Nickelodeon and watch whatever was on because there wasn't that much of a choice. Whereas now we're in the generation of quote unquote iPad kids who can just consume anything that they want to. And I think also like parents have a little bit less control over what their kids are consuming because the internet just everything is just so accessible. It's a challenge to create something with the same impact that Disney had when we were growing up, when there's all of these social platforms, when there's YouTube, when there's so much more content that's out there. I do think, though, two things. One is kids' content always benefits from existing in its own lane, where even though I say the parents have less control than they used to, a lot of parents do still like to try and control what their kids watch and are looking for kid friendly content and that kind of stuff. Disney has to appeal to the parents as much as, if not more than, the kids, is also ironically what helped them in the 2000s, because while everyone else was dealing with declining CD sales, they were selling the kids' CDs to the parents who would buy them for the kids who were still buying CDs. Disney kind of benefits from that generational, you're really appealing to the parents a lot of the time. And then the other thing I was going to say is Disney's partnership with Epic Games is really interesting because that could be a way into the channels for entertainment that more and more kids are paying attention to today. Like I could almost see the games replacing Disney Channel or Disney movies as the space where you understand the story and become a fan of the characters. And then the music exists as part of that.
Yeah, I think in general, with both of the things you said, Disney's ability to tie in everything it does beyond just the sole individual medium has always been its strength. And
Mm-hmm.
when you look at the strategies that you hear now about music, everyone's trying to push super fans, or companies like Hive with their transmedia strategy and storytelling. This is the type of stuff that Disney was really strong at. I think in general, we'll likely see more fragmentation. But on the other hand, when there's more options than ever, the laws kind of converge to people wanting to feel like there's something they can coalesce around. And
Yeah.
Disney's in a much stronger position. And there really isn't a Nickelodeon that has the same strength in that kind of way.
Yeah. I also wonder if, with things being more fragmented and as a result, that ecosystem feeling a little bit more open, if it would ironically make it easier for some of these artists who worry about too tied to Disney to stay tied to Disney, if that makes sense. Like maybe because it doesn't feel so tethered the way that it used to, it can be easier for Hollywood Records to feel like its own label that is not immediately associated with Disney.
No, I could see that. I could see that. Thinking about the artists that have came through, it feels like Olivia Rodrigo seems like the best case scenario that has gone through this. Came through Disney, got the benefits, didn't stay too long, had the option, went with the major record label, and the career
Mm-hmm.
has really taken off from there. It feels like the other big success stories, Disney either didn't capture enough value, maybe they captured too much, and it led to some tension, it led to some
Mm-hmm.
challenges for that particular person. But it feels like the Olivia Rodrigo situation is probably the best case scenario.
Yeah. I also don't think that it's necessarily a bad thing if Disney and its Disney Music Group becomes like a launch pad and artists do end up going a different direction at a certain point. I think that's a valuable role to play. I know they want to go beyond that and I think that there's ways that they can. I think there's such an emphasis these days because of how competitive everything is to own every part of the pipeline and for everything to be to serve everyone. But I also think there's value in being the incubator, in being the launch pad, capturing that value at that point in a career.
Yeah, if you stay too long, it's almost like being on a TV show for so long, right? You look at a show like Seinfeld, it took a long time for some of those stars, whether it's Julia Louis-Dreyfus and others, to really have a career that came from it. The biggest star from Game of Thrones might be Hannah Waddingham, who was on Ted Lasso. I mean, you never would have saw that
I know.
coming. Is there a star that came through Disney that you feel like, oh, I wish that they could have had a second chance. I wish that things could have went a bit differently for them. And maybe
Hmm.
like they had all the potential, they had all the right things, but it just didn't quite click for a music career.
That's a really good question. There's Vanessa Hudgens, there's Raven Simone.
You have some people like Zendaya, who of course came through the pipeline, but her music didn't take off, but her acting clearly did.
Allie and AJ,
You have Ashley Tisdale.
Vanessa Hudgens. She's someone who was a really huge star at one point, but hasn't been as visible. I don't know what films she's done recently. What's she up to?
She was in the Spring Breakers movie with Selena Gomez, and who we probably should have mentioned earlier in this conversation, but she was in that movie in like 2012.
Yeah,
She in some like Andrew
great
Garfield
movie.
movie a couple years ago. It was on Netflix. It was like a semi-musical. I forget the name of it. She was in something else I think I watched like semi recently. So yeah, definitely lead more into acting. But I remember there was like some single
Yeah.
that came out like late 2000s that maybe
Oh
got
my
some
God,
radio
wait.
play.
What
Just
was
didn't
the
click.
one? What was the one where like sneaker night or something?
Oh, I don't know
She
that
had
one.
this single that I feel like was resurfaced to me on the internet recently, and the video was just so 2000s. It hurts. Oh God,
Yeah.
I forgot what it was called. Anyways, there's so many things like that. But I don't know the others. I guess I feel like with Zendaya, for example, massive talent. I don't feel like I'm like missing a music career from her. Like I am a huge fan, but I don't like none of these people do I feel like I expected them to go in a different direction. I remember bringing up to you, which of course, because I can't not think about the data angle, is how Disney's demographic under 16s is also really hard to survey and even to advertise to and to reach just generally because of like restrictions. Like at MIDiA, we don't survey under 16s because of GDPR regulations. So I think it's an age group that marketers are trying to figure out what's different about them from the other generations, how should we be prepared for these changing tastes and things like that, and it can be hard to discern and hard to study. It's more something that I feel like we've picked up just anecdotally, the difficulty with trying to understand the kids these days.
And there was never really any true commercials on the Disney Channel from
Right,
what I
that's
could
a good point
remember,
too.
right? There were more segments to promote other things, but it was still within the Disney ecosystem. It wasn't like there was Doritos or Pepsi commercials.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm trying to remember now, but I think you're right. It was like a lot of commercials for other Disney Channel shows and things like that. One final thing on the other companies replicating the Disney model thing. It's interesting because the major labels all have film departments, and Sony even has like an arm in gaming and hardware and things like that. Sony has talked about this Sony One strategy for a long time to bring those things together more, but having the pieces and bringing them together are totally different things. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that develops.
I know I've heard the Sony One thing too as well, but again, I don't know if I see the same type of connection where PlayStation almost feels like a very different company
Completely
than
separate.
feels
Yeah.
like the televisions as opposed to Sony Music Group. Even within Sony Music Group, I don't think about AWOL and Epic in the same type
Mhm.
of way, and I don't think most people do either.
And with a corporation that big, especially Sony, part of the reason we've been hearing about Sony One for 5 years is because it takes that long to change how a massive corporation like that works.
Yeah, maybe they need to get Future in a PlayStation 2 video, not PlayStation 2. Wow, I dated myself with that one. They need to get Future in a PlayStation 5 video game.
If you're listening.
Listen, we're giving
Yeah.
you all the game in this. Everyone wants to do super fan
All the
strategies. We're
ideas.
giving you the game right here. Tati, thanks again for coming on. This was fun.
Thanks for letting me embarrass myself to all of your listeners. See you next time, Dan.
Thanks for watching us on YouTube. For more breakdowns like this on the business of entertainment, media, and technology, make sure you like and subscribe to stay up to the latest on any of the insights that we have on Trapital, and make sure that you tell a friend about it as well. That helps continue to make sure that our show reaches the right people. Thanks again. Talk to you next time.